I'd like to thank IDSA for inviting me to participate in this conference, especially Namrata Goswami, and which has allowed me to embark on an out of Africa journey into the intellectual realms of Asian security, and be with my colleague Abhijit Singh, who participated in the symposium that I organized in November on the Indian Ocean South Atlantic Southern Africa nexus, so that we get some sense of the interconnectivity of the global commons in the Southern Oceans. Now, my maritime interest basically comes down to the geopolitical dynamics of what we're talking about, and the continental maritime nexus. What I'm going to do is to try to summarize my paper, which I think is a bit too dense to go through at great length. First off, by way of getting into the paper, it needs to be noted that when I started and finished working on it, I was only dimly aware at the time of U.S. President Barack Obama's impending visit to India, or in the run-up to it, that it was going to produce something on the magnitude of the U.S. India Joint Strategic Vision for the Asia Pacific and Indian Ocean region. Media attention received in both India and the U.S. has seen some touting of this joint vision as virtually amounting to an Indo-U.S. alliance, which tends to go against the non-alignment grain of India's often articulated emphasis on strategic autonomy and foreign policy independence. And indeed, other commentators have tended to counterpoint this as in no way amounting to an alliance or indicating any need India has for U.S. help in handling its ties with China. So this joint Indo-U.S. vision may be as enigmatic when it comes to deciphering Oriental mysteries and discerning India's calculus as the December 27th Chicago speech by Chinese Vice Premier Wang Yang under the title, "The United States is the guide of the world. China is willing to join this system." Okay. Nevertheless, there are aspects of the U.S.-India joint vision and some analyses of it that does amplify some points I make in my paper, and that I will be factored into a revised draft and touched on briefly here. All said, this paper is intended to conceptualize a continental maritime security equation analytical framework in exploring India's approach to advancing its interest in the Indian Ocean, and in so doing influence an evolving Asian power balance towards equilibrium. It involves analyzing challenges facing India in leveraging its capacities and strategic imagination to influence this evolution amid, first and foremost, the rise of China and U.S. rebalancing, but also factoring in the regional roles and potential of Japan and Indonesia, along with the growing federalist potential of regional economic communities. Concluding on an architectural note, it is suggested that a creatively assertive Indian diplomacy may be required in structuring a more clearly resolved and inclusive zone of peace multilateralism in the Indian Ocean. Therefore, the Indian Ocean is the obvious analytic point of reference in venturing an interpretive examination of India's approach to maritime security. Here, an attempt is made to contextualize India's approach as involving an interplay between continental as well as maritime geopolitical dynamics as a means of emphasizing the importance of understanding the maritime dimensions and possibilities of Indian diplomacy, and for that matter, of all maritime nations as being intimately interlinked with onshore continental developments and or an extension of them. And within the interrelated global and regional backdrop of India's calculus, its approach is seen as having to factor in navigating relations with China and the U.S., China in terms of its emergence as Asia's leading power and the security challenges this poses for India, while China and India are also increasingly regionally interdependent economically and closely aligned in pursuing global economic governance reform. The U.S., in terms of its diplomacy of balancing between West Asian and Greater South Asian and Asia Pacific interests and commitments as it seeks to come to terms with the rise of China, while maintaining and reinforcing its global and regional posture in Asia and what this means for India. For India, navigating the Sino-American nexus in a regionalizing strategic landscape of multipolarity involves considering China's trans-Eurasian integrationist Silk Route vision on the one hand, for which the maritime component is critical and impinges on the Indian Ocean, and on the other, the evolving repositioning of America's strategic posture based on what it can be called nation building at home compulsions. These are discussed at length in sections of the paper considering what India must factor into its calculus within a changing global landscape and strategic environment. Regarding relations with China, this involves a dynamic of what I call cooperation, as in alternating Sino-Indian economic cooperation and strategic competition. Whereas in terms of the U.S.-India dynamic, what I term a U.S. repositioning pattern of strategic devolution encourages an environment for greater inter-Asian engagement in regional cooperation and strategic partnerships that can contribute to a balance of power equilibrium in the Asian continental maritime security equation. Obviously, with China's regional rise animating this changing environment. Part of this regarding China has to do with what has been referred to the string of pearls and places not bases narratives, which David Brewster, in my view, has, I think, nicely demythologized. And this was in a paper that he gave last year at the National Maritime Foundation Conference. In discounting India being confronted by a strategic dilemma in the Indian Ocean on the basis of China's engagement throughout the rim. To be sure, this does not discount the need for Indian proactivity in shaping the Indian Ocean environment while expanding its own room for maneuver. Gordon Chang's counterpoint, emphasizing China's perceived threat in this regard underpins the importance of such considerations. Thus, for India, its look east policy, this infers a hedging and balancing approach irrespective of how closely India may align with the U.S.-Asian agenda or the state of Sino-Indian relations. Focus here is on India's inter-Asian relations rather than how it might calibrate its Asian diplomacy based on U.S. interest considerations. Here, Japan and Indonesia emerge as key Asian anchors in this analysis. As such, it is interesting that whereas I take a critical look at Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's quadrilateral security dialogues initiative involving Asian democratic so-called diamonds with Sino-containment overtones, that the prospect of this initiative being revived has been reported as an important talking point between Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and U.S. President Barack Obama. And this is against a backdrop of concern some have of rising Japanese nationalism amid growing Chinese regional assertiveness. The fact that Modi-Obama talks also touched on Washington's interest in having India become a member of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation amplifies that section in the paper discussing India's outlier status in relation to East Asia Pacific geopolitics. Because of references to Modi reportedly raising an interest in reviving Shinzo Abe's quadrilateral initiative, and Obama expressing interest in India joining APEC, the prospect that the U.S.-India joint vision may be more than a chimera is worth pondering. This could, however, be balanced by India along with Pakistan becoming full members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, something China has promised but which remains to be seen. All of which brings this summary to what I consider to be the main takeaway in my paper. And that has to do with the importance attached to much closer strategic partnership between India and Indonesia, a genuinely non-controversial alignment carrying none of the baggage attached to either the U.S. or China, but one that has a compellingly geostrategic and regional economic logic, and one with the potential for forging interregional cooperation between the SAARC and the ASEAN, which I think could be the, if one is looking for a core of an Indo-Pacific strategy, it could possibly be in forging such a relationship. This would amount to closely aligning two strategically pivotal maritime Asian powers in the Indo-Pacific. India astride the eastern and western Indian Ocean. Archipelagic Indonesia situated at the Indian Ocean Asia-Pacific nexus, both linking South and Southeast Asian regions along the inter-Asian maritime perimeter. There is thus a logic, given their apex regional power status within their respective neighborhoods, for facilitating coordinated interaction between ASEAN, which aspires to enter the next stage of integration as an economic community by the end of this year, and the SAARC, which requires substantially more strengthening and elevating into a more robust regional economic community as, and this is another conceptual point I try to make, we have entered a protracted period of ever greater institutional regionalism in global governance in what I like to call the rise of the Rex, amounting to an evolution towards global economic federalism. This I see posing a major challenge to India in terms of what seems a constrained regional integration imagination burdened by unresolved issues with Pakistan. Again, with Sino-American baggage in the background, and its focus on its national interest, when, in my view, India is more than just a nation state, but rather a subcontinental regional state at the intersections of Southwest, Central, and Southeast Asia, as well as at the meeting point between the Eastern and Western Indian Ocean. Perhaps prospects, it has been suggested for a coalition government in Jammu and Kashmir, accompanied by renewed Indo-Pakistan dialogue, if this happens, might unlock this logjam, thereby potentially revitalizing SAARC, while energizing integrationist momentum in South Asia, further altering India's regional balance of power calculus and security environment. Thus, a strategic maritime dialogue between India and Indonesia might be an initiative for both to contemplate in terms of each country's respective maritime and oceans governance agendas, for which they should have much to deliberate on beyond security issues, since both are embarking on blue economy trajectories. And in India's case, this could further motivate enhancing the national integration of its northeast in accessing the Bay of Bengal in convergence with China's agenda of opening its southwest to this same maritime domain. Something of a interregionalized Chindian convergence. Now the question, obviously, though, based on what we've been discussing, is whether this will inspire greater geoeconomic competition, cooperation, or some mix of both, in a word, cooperation. However, and this is where I will conclude, the strategic security focal point of convergence between India and Indonesia might revolve, and this is where I depart from my colleague, around renewed attention being given to revisiting the zone of peace status of the Indian Ocean linked to the Asia Pacific. In my thinking, this is something that may warrant greater elaboration approaching the level of the still under-institutionalized but more clearly agenda-setting zone of peace and cooperation in the South Atlantic. The zone of peace in the South Atlantic is not a mere declaration. I mean, it is a it is a fledgling multilateral organ. In other words, there might need to be a going beyond a mere declaration towards something along the lines of a zone of peace and cooperation, not simply zone of peace, but zone of peace and cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, that in turn might serve as an overarching architectural framework for all Indian Ocean maritime stakeholders, and ultimately a basis for an Indian Ocean, South Atlantic, Southern Oceans maritime security and cooperation system. This is where I also detect the strategic utility of IDSA, which in fact was one of the subtexts of the symposium that we had in November, as a possible special summitry platform for vetting such possibilities, though I believe that as members of IORA, the place to start might best be served by a bilateral dialogue between Delhi and Jakarta on the road to envisioning the Indian Ocean, so-called, the way Kaplan put it, the Indian Ocean New World Order, as a complementary counterpoint to Beijing's maritime Silk Route. So in closing, I mean, I think that from a proactive standpoint, this is where this is where India could take a very positive initiative and turn something that is that may be overly security focused into something that could develop a much broader multilateral cooperation dimension. And to me, of course, I remain to hear it, but to me, I see no reason why, out of all of this, an India-Indonesian partnership should not be activated along these lines. Thank you.